All right, now let's delve into Nigeria's public debt, which the stock has risen from 35.4 trillion naira in the second quarter of 2021 to 42.8 trillion naira in the second quarter of 2022. And this includes external and domestic debt, according to the National Bureau of Statistics, NBS, in its Nigerian domestic and foreign debt report for the second quarter of 2021 to the second quarter of 2022, released in Abuja on Wednesday. The NBS stated that external debt stood at 13.7 trillion naira in the second quarter of 2021 and increased to 16.6 trillion naira in the second quarter of 2022. And this has raised fresh concerns about the healthy nature of the country's borrowing. Today on the show, we will be discussing this further with Enebi Opalua, Senior Research and Policy Analyst at Budget. Thank you for joining us, Enebi.
Thank you very much for having me on the show.
Good to have you on the show. Let's start by getting your reaction to Nigeria's debt stock jumping to 42.8 trillion naira in June 30, 2022. Can you hear me, Enebi?
Okay, I can hear you, but the audio the network seems to be a bit fuzzy. But I can hear you now.
Yes, I was asking for your reaction to Nigeria's debt stock, which jumped to 42.8 trillion naira in June 2022.
Okay, thank you very much. It is quite unfortunate that, let's say, the sad development that we seem to be amassing a lot of debt as a country. Obviously, we do not receive that with enthusiasm, and much more alarming is our ability to service the debt. As at the first quarter of this year, debt service to revenue ratio was over 100%. So we can see the enormous pressure that the present debt situation is having on our revenue and income as a country. I think it's an urgent, it's an emergency, and a lot needs to be done on how we respond and reverse the trend.
Well, you say we need to reverse the trend, but we have heard and seen the body language of the Minister of Finance, Budget and National Planning, that's Zainab Ahmed, saying that the debt to GDP ratio is quite sustainable and that Nigeria is still on a good trend.
Okay, well, I definitely that would be the natural response to any, let's say, question on that. The thing is, first of all, there are two metrics that we use in looking at this situation. There is the debt to GDP ratio and then the debt to revenue ratio. Now, debt to GDP ratio just simply measures the volume or the amount of debt you have as a country and measures along the economic activity you have within that country. The tipping point is actually around 77% as recommended by the IMF. However, presently, Nigeria is nowhere near that. I think we are somewhere around between 17 and 20% in terms of debt to GDP ratio. But that is not the case. A lot of experts have argued that the debt to GDP ratio is not a sufficient metric to measure your sustainability. You can't spend GDP. It just tells you how much economic activity is going on in your country. It doesn't tell you how much goes to your coffers. If another country comes and spends money in your country, it adds to your GDP. If the revenue or the proceeds are taken out of your economy, it still adds to your GDP. So just measure spending and buying and selling generally in your economy. What is much more of concern is the debt to revenue ratio. It's quite alarming that we have exceeded 100%. It should not be, because the thing is that when you generate income, you need to use the income for other activities. You need you have capital projects, you have development projects, you have recurrent needs to meet, and you cannot allocate your entire revenue to servicing your debt. It's not just the amount of debt that you've accumulated, it's the amount of revenue that you allocate to servicing that debt. And for now, it is quite alarming. Last year, overall in 2021, Nigeria spent over 2 trillion naira in debt servicing. This is data from the Debt Management Office. Over 2 trillion naira in debt servicing, whereas our revenue was somewhere about 3 point something, close to 4 trillion naira. That is not a sustainable position to be in. You have serious needs as a country, especially one as like Nigeria, who is developing. We have security needs, we have infrastructure needs, and the consequences that you now have to borrow more to cater to your pressing needs. You can look at the 2023 budget, according to that was just released, and you realize that we have a budget proposal of 9 trillion in terms of revenue and debt servicing for over 6 trillion. That is over 60% of revenue already. Assuming we are able to meet our target of 9 trillion naira as a country. If you look at last year, our target was 7.9 trillion. We were able to make about 50% of that. So there is no guarantee that we are going to get all the revenue that we desire to get. What we need to do as a country is, yes, curb the way we borrow. Borrowing is part of government financing. In fact, it's if you look at general economics, if you want to avoid raising taxes, you go and borrow. All right. So right now, I'm sure every Nigerian wouldn't want the government to raise taxes.
Some scary figures you just reeled out now, and especially looking at the 2023 budget, which of course has a deficit of about 12 trillion naira. But the finance minister is supposed to be someone knowledgeable about the economy, and she has taken the position and is expected to, take some decisions that would help the economy. But if she is one of the people saying, well, we're still on a right, healthy trend, what does this bode for the economy?
Well, that's just sends signals that the government still has an appetite for borrowing. Now, the more your debt increases, the more investors begin to panic. When you begin to assess your bonds, creditors begin to give your bonds weak credit ratings, and then investors begin to shy away. When investors run away from your economy, I'm not saying that we are there yet, but considering the warning of the World Bank and the IMF, we are on track to that position.
Absolutely. Even the IMF and the World Bank raised, some alarm recently, talking about how our debt to GDP ratio isn't sustainable and how we need to begin to look into that and take some measures to curb the trend. But the question would be, if the federal government and the managers of the economy are ready to do the needful.
It have GDP ratio. Yes. When in terms of debt to GDP ratio as a country, it looks like we are still within sustainable bands. The finance minister might be in her ambit to say that the country is still in a good position based on that metric. But right now, I think where we are as a country, we have to just tell ourselves the truth. Revenue from oil is almost, it's unpredictable. In this year, NNPC has hardly remitted much to the federation account. And so, and our non-oil revenue has nowhere come close to our oil revenue. So we are still an oil-dependent economy. So we need to tell ourselves the truth. We need to raise more revenue, definitely, and we need to reduce our appetite for borrowing so as to keep our economy from approaching its tipping point.
Well, the Minister of Finance, Zainab Ahmed, has also said that the country would be considering debt restructuring. Do you see this as the way to go? Idebi, can you hear me?
Okay, I think you're back now. I can hear you now.
Yes, please go ahead. Idebi, I was asking if you think debt restructuring is the way to go, as proposed by the Minister of Finance.
Hello.
Can you hear me now? All right, looks like he's finding it difficult to hear me, but we would try to link back up with Idebi. But let's also look at all of these issues surrounding debt restructuring. What does it mean for the economy? Would it deal with the issue of the rising debt stock, or would it, help us to maybe stop being debt dependent and maybe look into how we can boost revenue. Thank you for joining us again. Enebi. All right, some glitches there, but we would fix it. Let's look at all of these issues as Nigeria's debt stock continues to rise right now at 42.8 trillion naira. That's as at June. We don't even know what the figures would be right now because the figures are not yet out as regards what the debt stock is right now. Thank you for joining us.
All right, thank you very much. My
Yes.
pleasure to be on the show. Thank you very much.
So I was asking what your thoughts are on the proposed debt restructuring by the Minister of Finance.
Well, that is one other perspective. Is another, let's say, tool, another instrument that can be used to restructure our debt. But the thing is, you restructure your debt and then you borrow more. It's
But maybe we should start from what it entails, actually, this debt restructuring. What does it mean to the layman?
okay. When debt restructuring, first of all, it looks at the parameters of your debt, your borrowing parameters, and then perhaps allows you to pay back your debt over a longer period of time. That is one way. Another way is to find how you can reduce, or let's say, debt forgiveness. Ask for some leeway to reduce the total debt stock. Now, many developing countries have pushed that argument because of the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. Many oil resource countries, developing nations, found they were hit hard. And so, obviously, debt across the world increased and put much more developing nations in much more precarious position. So these nations tend to advocate for some form of debt reduction or debt forgiveness. Now, this is not the first time Nigeria has gone through that process under the Obasanjo era in forgiving of our debt. I think the Paris funds. But if you look at
we also saw President Muhammadu Buhari asking for debt forgiveness at the recent summit.
Yes, and one other way that they've looked at it is okay. The current climate change summit looks at how developing nations can contribute, or not just developing nations, countries across the world can contribute to reducing climate change. And one proposal that has been put on the table was to forgive the debt of developing nations, African nations, in response to, or in return for some climate adaptation, some climate-focused efforts to reducing climate change. That is one way of looking at it. But I think what African economies should be looking at the climate change conference right now is to actually get the world to understand their situation. We understand that there is an urgent need for climate action, but African economies and developing nations contribute a very meager amount to total emissions globally. Less than 4% of emissions globally come from Africa, whereas we have countries like the United States doing over 10%, China is doing over 25%. So these advanced economies should take the bulk of responsibility when it comes to climate action. So I think African countries should push that argument and see.
So you subscribe to going for debt forgiveness. Well, some people would say that that is some form of simplistic way of approaching the debt crisis that the country is facing. Because if every time we're faced with a huge debt crisis, we go for debt forgiveness, then where does that leave us? Are we going to see that as a sustainable way to deal with the issue? Welcome back.
Much more, there's a better situation. So it may not be. Okay, thank you.
Go ahead.
It's not a sustainable way to deal with the issue because we keep increasing the debt envelope. We keep increasing the debt envelope. That is not a sustainable way to deal with the issue. What I was trying to explain was that, first of all, we cannot ignore the fact that we are an oil-dependent economy, and at our present situation demands that we get revenue from oil. So throwing oil out of the window right now may not be
All right, quite distorted, but
best.
quite an interesting conversation here.
Understand agents of climate change can be phased out. Can you hear me now?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, right. So like I said, oil can be phased out over time because whether we like it or not, the oil economy is going to go away. We won't get revenue from that.
Especially as there's this transition. Yeah, I was talking about the transition to renewable energy by developed countries.
We also need to understand that, yes. So, but we need to understand that we need energy to develop.
Absolutely.
We need energy to run our economy. We need energy to run our industries. We need energy. It is simple. And the lowest hanging fruit for us right now as a country is oil and gas. Now, the government rolled out the energy transition plan sometime in October, and that puts gas as a transition fuel, which I believe is quite a move in the right direction. It shows that the government understands the situation, that we have a lot of gas resources and we can use that to develop our economy. That is true and that is good. Over time, we can do that and then transit from oil, reduce our dependence on oil, and perhaps in the next 20-30 years, we would have developed enough capacity in terms of renewable and clean energy. I think Africa as a continent and African countries need to push that narrative at the climate change conference and tell the world that, look, we are not responsible for the situation on ground right now, but we can do our part, but not without paying attention to our current needs as a country and as a region.
So in wrapping up, what alternative solutions do you think we need to be exploring right now?
Definitely, the focus is to increase revenue. First, our non-oil revenue needs to be improved. There are several efforts in place, but I think the government can do more in increasing our non-oil revenue. That is a no-brainer. It is an urgent situation we need to tackle. Secondly, we need to go deep into our oil sector and stop the leakages. We have outrageous figures coming out from the sector of oil theft. That is insane in a country that is dependent on oil for its lifeline. So as a country, stop the leakages, prevent infrastructural damage, stop oil theft. That will...
All right, I think we'll just leave it there. Thank you so much for your time on the show, Enebi Opalua. It's been a very enlightening session. Well, after the break, the National Development Plan 2021 to 2025 had a vision to unlock the potential of the country in all sectors of the economy for a sustainable, holistic, and inclusive national development. Now, what's in place for the country's unemployment rate? We'll be right back to discuss that.